Welcome everyone. Just giving everyone a few minutes to get in and get settled before we get started. Okay. And I think we're okay to go. So Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Hina. So before I begin with a land acknowledgement to help open the space, I'd like to ask folks to find a way to connect to the chair you're sitting in, the earth below you, whatever feels most accessible and comfortable for you, to be connecting with your mind, with your feet on the ground. Just gather in our presence. We need a lot more than just words and often academic jargon in order to do this work. We need to connect, we need to be connected. So as we just sit grounded, let's take a breath in together. Wilfrid Laurier University and its campuses are located on the Haldimand Tract, the traditional territory of the Neutral, Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, and most recently, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations peoples. The Haldimand Tract of October 25th, 1784. These lands, which we are currently occupying, have been stolen through colonization. Every non-Indigenous peoples are benefiting from the dispossession of Indigenous peoples who never ceded their sovereignty and who've never received proper reparation nor acknowledgement of the crimes committed against them. Our land acknowledgement cannot exist in a past context or past tense. Colonialism is a current and ongoing intentional project that as non-Indigenous peoples we contribute to every day. We must first ground ourselves in the understanding that colonialism shapes and impacts all aspects of the ways in which we enact change and how power imbalances and oppression is acted out. It is important to always incorporate this into our critical analysis and our work. We are here as a result of blood that has been shed by colonization, and we must recognize and look to the efforts of those who came 7 generations before us. The work of fighting for equity must be framed as an anti-colonial struggle, not simply one based in diversity and inclusion. Racism, sexism, and misogyny, homophobia and transphobia, ableism, classism have all been tools used to enact colonialism and genocide against Indigenous peoples and communities since contact, also known as collision. During this talk, later tonight, throughout the week, moving forward, let's reflect on, commit to, and take accountability for the ways in which we can center the voices and experiences of Indigenous as well as other marginalized academics, researchers, teachers, artists, frontline workers, creatives, meaning makers, and free thinkers in finding ways to actually uphold equity and social justice work. Thank you for joining us here today. A couple of details to get us started. This event is being live captioned. Please note that you can turn on or hide the live transcript by pressing the CC live transcript button on the Zoom menu. Today's event will be recorded for internal purposes. Any opportunities to view all or part of the recording will be forwarded to those who registered. Please note that the recording or sharing of this event on your own device is strictly prohibited. Today's conversation will be followed by a Q&A period. Please put all questions into the Q&A feature. We hold a zero tolerance policy for comments or questions that are deemed discriminatory or hateful in nature. Any participant engaging in this form of commentary will be removed from the webinar. I also want to be explicit that myself and the person I'm interviewing are not academics. So please remember that when you're putting your Q&A questions in, that if you actually want a real answer, you need to write questions that we understand. And I'm not even really fully joking with that. Good afternoon and welcome to the second installment of the Lamine Diallo EDI speaker series here at Laurier. Very excited about this. My name is Sarah Scanlon and I'm the Manager Sexual Violence Response out of the Office of Human Rights and Conflict Management. Last November, the Office of the Associate Vice President, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, in collaboration with the Tshepo Institute for the Study of Contemporary Africa and Laurier's Black Faculty and Staff Caucus, I just lost my notes. Don't you love when that happens? Thank you. Launched this annual EDI speaker series, which has been named in honor of Dr. Lamine Diallo, a distinguished scholar, associate professor in the leadership program, and founding member of our two partnering groups here at Wilfrid Laurier University. One of our institution's longtime champions promoting notions of equity, diversity, and inclusion across our campuses. This event is in recognition of his tireless efforts to embed these same principles into our collective consciousness. Consistent with Laurier's broader EDI institutional strategy, the Lamine Diallo EDI speaker series will help to raise awareness, competencies, and understandings about equity, diversity, and inclusion within the context of Canadian universities, while at the same time encouraging and fostering meaningful conversations with all members of the Laurier community. Each event will serve to complement other EDI dialogues taking place across the university about a range of equity issues that exist in our society and at Laurier. Every year, the Office of the AVP EDI will invite a number of featured speakers to participate in this event. Speakers for this series will consist of recognized internal Laurier EDI champions, community activists, administrative and professional practitioners, and academic speakers from across the country. Reflections from EDI Champions. The overarching theme of this year's event provides opportunities for invited speakers to share some of their individual and unique experiences, journeys, passions, reflections, and thoughts about the things that have guided and informed their work as it relates to the issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion in a university environment. As EDI advocates, we'll hear more about some of the successes and challenges that have resulted from their work and ideas about how we, as a university community, continue striving to ensure these principles are firmly rooted in the ethos and culture of Wilfrid Laurier University. Thanks for coming. I would now like to introduce the fabulous Shireen Rowe, General Counsel in the Legal Services and Fair Practices Office here at Laurier, to say a few words about today's invited speaker. Thanks, Shireen.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to introduce Don McDermott for this event today. Don's role is as Senior Advisor in the Office of Human Rights and Conflict Management. And although it'll be hard to believe this when you see her, she has over 25 years of experience working with people and organizations in crisis, implementing community programs, and developing institutional supports for people's experiencing marginalization, victimization, harassment, discrimination, and violence. Prior to joining Laurier in 2012, Dawn held a variety of professional positions working with and advocating for individuals experiencing or at risk of violence. She's worked with organizations to develop best practices, guidelines to manage conflict, and conducted domestic violence safety audits. I've had the pleasure of working with Dawn since she arrived at Laurier, and she's been instrumental in developing strong policies and processes to address issues relating to harassment, discrimination, and sexual violence at Laurier, as well as works closely with employees and students to help them manage conflict and navigate internal processes. Dawn and her team are responsible for addressing interpersonal disputes between individuals and within groups at Laurier. Her office also acts as the university's ombuds, hearing student and staff formal complaints regarding unfair processes or policy violations. Additionally, she hears, resolves when possible, and investigates formal complaints regarding discrimination, harassment, and sexual violence under university policies. As you can appreciate, this work is critically important for the university, and she and her team are focused on being creative and effective in helping all members of the university community. Dawn has completed advanced mediation training from Harvard University and the JAMS Resolution Center in Washington, D.C. She's also completed her Master's of Law degree through Osgoode Hall at York University, with a focus on alternative dispute resolution, along with a Bachelor of Arts degree with a major in communication studies and sociology from the University of Windsor. In addition to her responsibilities as senior advisor, she is a contract faculty member at Laurier, a facilitator for Queen's Industrial Relations Center, a mediator, a crucial conversations train the trainer, and a mental health first aid trainer. She's also, I find, always looking for ways to enhance supports. She's tenacious in the work that she does, and really supports her team and everyone at Laurier to help them embed consideration of equity, diversity, and inclusion in all areas of their work. She's a strong EDI advocate, and I think a great person to talk to us today about her own personal and professional experiences and reflections on issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion at Laurier. So I'm very happy to turn it over to Dawn and Sarah to lead us through today's event.
Thank you so much, Shireen.
Wow, that could have gone anyway.
Any direction. I know I was holding my breath a couple moments there. I'm like, what could come out in this moment?
It was.
So I want to dive in because I know that we don't have a ton of time, and not everyone maybe caught that, but Dawn is actually my boss and Shireen's my head boss. And as the joke I made earlier, because who doesn't want to hear three awesome white ladies talk about equity, diversity, inclusion? But we're really excited to dive into it. And I actually would like to start with a question that feels a bit more vulnerable. I think it's really important to step back from the ways in which we typically frame this work, which has a lot of like walls and boundaries through academic work and our professionalism. And I think in order to do really good equity work, we need to be able to situate ourselves more vulnerably. So as I said, too often we frame this work through a solely professional or academic framework, but most of us come to this work because of experiences of a struggle and resiliences. Most people know you as a tough and caring human rights advocate, but less know you as the human that is guiding that role. What drew you, the full human Dawn, to this work?
First of all, I am so honored to be in the presence of you two great white women and everybody else who has come to listen to this conversation. And I have to be honest, I'm still not convinced this isn't like a Comedy Central roast. We're going to be like calling people out to make lots of fun of me, but here I am.
That's in the second half.
Okay. All right. Super humbled to be here. And I appreciate the question. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this conversation and what would be important to share. And I think part of my narrative is the way in which I was raised in the family that I had the privilege of being part of. So I had a really positive childhood, and my family prioritized people over possessions and service over individual needs. And so I think those are kind of the core values that guided me to the work that I do, and the core values that really are the guiding principles around EDI work. So I was raised by an extraordinary woman. My mom was a single parent from the time I was about 8 or 9, and she was born to a father who immigrated from Romania, and my grandmother whose parents immigrated from the Ukraine. And she grew up in Windsor, Ontario on Drouillard Street, which is probably the most impoverished street, or at the time was, in Windsor. And she lived above a dry cleaners in a 1-bedroom apartment with her family. She emulated hard work and humility, and she believed that you had to do everything 100%, and that you were loyal, family meant everything, and you had an obligation to care for the people in your life. My grandmother was a bit of a trailblazer. She was a teacher in a 1-room school in Alberta. She was the only woman in her town to drive a car, and she was proud to have been a spinster, as she identified, until she was in her late 30s, when she finally caved and married my grandfather. She was tremendously influential in my life. I spent most of my weekends growing up with her, hearing stories about her trailblazing ways. And while I was raised with really strong female presence, including my sister, who was absolutely my best friend, it was probably my dad that had the most influence on me and my career. So my dad was a super quiet, had super stealth-like humor, quiet, big, imposing man, beautiful man. And he was fierce, and he was charismatic in a way that people felt and people got. And he had a variety of jobs, and his career changed quite often. But one of his jobs was, he was a bouncer in a bar. Super exciting to have a dad that's a bouncer. He taught some weird kind of combat fighting, some strange fighting that my sister and I were his students from the time we were 4. We had to learn how to defend ourselves in the event that we were attacked on the streets by a stranger who was trying to rape us. He was profoundly committed to human rights, but it was never named that he was a human rights activist or that human rights were his priority. When I was in kindergarten, I remember my father wasn't around much either. So there were these moments in time that resonate with me that felt pretty pivotal and important in my life. And I remember one of those moments being when I started kindergarten. He called me for a conversation, called me aside for a conversation in his very quiet way. He said, I understand that at your school, there is a class called, it was something called like an opportunities class. And at the time, we identified the students in those classes retarded, and some of them had physical disabilities. And he said, I've come to understand this, and I'm going to tell you, and that was the language at the time, I've come to understand this, and I'm going to tell you right now, if I find out that any one of my children make a disparaging comment or tease a child that has less than them, you will be severely punished. It was a really direct, quiet message. And at the time, I didn't even know what punishment was. I can tell you, growing up, I don't ever remember being punished. I was held to my own account, and I was expected to behave in a certain way. But that message that he gave to me said, this is really important stuff, and you better pay attention. He taught me that I had privilege, that everybody has a story, and that because I have a privilege, I have an obligation to behave in a certain way. When I was 9 or 10, he sat me down and he said, I want you to know that you won't be getting Christmas gifts anymore. And I was, my father did some strange things. So I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. And I was deeply hurt. And he explained to me that we were lucky that we had things, and we had a home, and we had enough food on the table, and we wouldn't be getting presents because other kids needed money, and he was going to give our Christmas money to other kids. He was a forerunner in thinking about how he can support community. He started these businesses all the time, these weird businesses, and he only hired people from St. Leonard's House in Windsor, which was a halfway house. He only hired people who had done significant time in the federal penitentiary. And so I grew up surrounded by people who had spent 20 years in Kingston. My uncle, for lack of a better term, the closest person to our family, his name was Wayne Ford, and he was Toronto's most notorious criminal. He murdered his mom and was involved in organized crime. But he was part of our everyday existence, and we just knew, we were just taught that people deserve redemption, people deserve a second chance, and people deserve support, and it's our obligation in our community to do that. I knew that I had access to information and to people in a way that other kids didn't. So the interesting part of it was we weren't privileged in terms of money. I mean, housing was very precarious for me and my mom and my brother and my sister. I was very aware that we would struggle to have food. And my father was homeless after my parents separated. He squatted in an abandoned building for months and then lived in various places that we really didn't know where he was. He would come in and out of our lives. But he was this incredibly magnetic man who just held priorities that were really important to us and really ingrained in us in very, very young age. So I always felt like I didn't want any other life. I had access to these amazing people. I remember in grade 7, I had met one of my dad's employees and was fascinated by his story. He was a pyromaniac, and he explained to me, you know, the erotic connection between fire and, you know, his path and his prison term and his rehabilitation. And I remember I went to school in grade 7. I delivered a speech on pyromania to my class, and my teacher pulled me aside and said, "That's a great speech, and you won't be delivering that to the school. Like, this is like, this is not something that you can talk about with people in grade 7 and grade 8." So, you know, there were these moments of learning that were bizarre, but was my father, you know, later on when I was in my teens, he thought it was really important on Christmas Eve to show us and our partners, our boyfriends, girlfriends, live footage of guard brutality towards prisoners that one of his colleagues or employees had captured while in prison. We were shot at when he fired one of his employees, but we were always taught, you are fortunate, you are blessed, you are privileged, and you are here to serve. Service and deference. You defer to other people, you learn from other people. People are redeemable, and you have an obligation to participate in that. He had great stories. He had amazing stories. He was recruited by the police to do some undercover work with them. And he, you know, helped them catch like a serial rapist. And he was kicked out of school in grade 9. And he, even though he was very, very bright, his story was that he was kicked out of school because he had beaten up these boys because they had tortured cats at a bonfire. He was a huge animal activist, and he still is. He was just an incredibly interesting person. He was an artist. He made beautiful jewelry. He had a particular interest in Indigenous art, and his story was that he was adopted and that his biological parents were Indigenous. And we held that story for a number of years. I adored him and all of his humanity, and he wasn't very accessible. He'd come in and out of our lives. He loathed the thought of living in a family structure, and he loved the thought of helping people. So what I came to know later on is half of his stories weren't true. He was delusional. You know, he was living with an undiagnosed mental health problem, and he was delusional. And it really helped me to understand when my sister was diagnosed later on with schizoaffective disorder, how our family had been negatively impacted by serious mental health. And that's when I became an advocate for my sister throughout the years that she was institutionalized. I never, ever for a moment didn't value every minute that I had with my parents and the lessons that I learned from him in particular, in many ways. He taught me not to be afraid of anything at all. And so, well, that's not true. I have lots of fears. We can talk about that another time. But, but certainly the message of, you know, humility, deference, and service. Deference and service, humility was what I got throughout my entire upbringing. And you know what? He was the only dad that showed up at his daughter's prom. And when I got married to my first husband, he hired a stand-up comedian to do impersonations during the father of the bride speech. So it was really an interesting path towards understanding what I needed to do to be part of my family and my community.
Thanks for sharing, Dawn. Yeah, I've heard some of the stories, but not all of them. I really appreciate that. And if folks are wondering some of Dawn's fears, you just check out her Google and her WebMD, because she thinks she has every disease every day. And
only when I'm really stressed out.
I go back and forth between validating them and having to be like, no,
I need you. I need you.
Don't have that random disease that you found out about yesterday. Yeah, that was really awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's really important to understand. I think we often don't actually understand the like path that brought us to different places. And it's really helpful to have empathy and understanding for each other as like colleagues and learners in the work. Yeah. So before I ask the next question, I just want to do a really quick content warning. John and I both work in the Office of Human Rights and Conflict Management, and one of the portfolios underneath that office is specifically related to sexual violence and intimate partner violence, as well as harassment, discrimination, and other types of human rights violations and oppression-based harms. Just by the nature of Our work, I just want to name that if people are feeling activated, there will be no details about sexual harm, but if people are feeling activated, please reach out to svinfo@wlu.ca, and I'll add that in if you're feeling activated. And also just a reminder, take care of yourself, because sometimes when we talk about the work, that alone can impact us. So I want to talk about your pathway into the work professionally. You have a background specifically in sexual violence, intimate partner violence, crisis response, harassment, discrimination, and human rights violation focused legislation. What was your pathway professionally into equity work, and what were the pivotal moments of your career that landed you here in this role at Laurier?
So that was the easiest thing to wrap my mind around. When you told me last night you're going to ask that question, I immediately, as I'm sure you could, said, oh God, yeah, these four things, these four pivotal career changing moments, I feel have really impacted the way I do my work and the way I think about my work. And so the first one, and some of you have heard this before, in particular, if there's anybody from Laurier International, my good friends over there, I tell this story when I do some cross-cultural conflict training for them. When I graduated from university when I was 20. And so I decided that I would do something fun. And part of what I did was get a job with the Salvation Army. And I was actually called a street walker. So between 6 and 10 at night, I would walk the streets downtown, and I would make friends with homeless youth. But then in the afternoon, I would teach low-cost nutritional cooking to Canadian newcomers. And so I was 20 years old. I knew how to make like mac and cheese and pizza, like box pizza. But I got this really sweet gig. And so every day I would come together, and usually it was a number of women it was primarily women that would attend these classes, and they would come to learn how to cook Canadian food. And they were amazing cooks. But when they came, we would prepare food and they could take it home to their family. So I was scrambling, trying to learn how to make Canadian dishes. But what ultimately happened is we formed this community of incredible, we formed this incredible community that came together every day, and they taught me how to cook. They taught me how to cook, and we didn't speak each other's languages most of the time. And we laughed and we had so much fun. And most days after I was cooking, they would come back and they would often bring one of their kids with them, often a son, and say, you helped our family today, and now we would like to help you. What can we help you do around here in your job? And I was blown away by that sense of community. And it made me really want more. I thought, I need to know more about different ways of being in community, and I need to know more about how I can show up for people in the same way that people have shown up for me. And so that was one of those pivotal moments that had taken me throughout my career to really focus a lot of my work on Canadian newcomers and people who had different ethnocultural backgrounds and experiences. Super important. After I left the Salvation Army, I got hired in this sweet gig. It was an attorney general program. I was 22, and I was the founding manager of the supervised access program, which essentially supervised visits between non-custodial parents and their children, oftentimes when there had been child abuse or sexual assaults, and definitely 80% of the time when there had been intimate partner violence. I was completely unprepared for the job. I was completely unprepared to sit down and listen to people's stories and support children who were required by law to see their parents even when they didn't want to. And there were two moments in that time period that seriously impacted me. And one of them was, there was a little boy who didn't want to see his father. I had interviewed the father, and he told me about extreme child abuse and sexual assault that he had perpetrated against his child. And he had turned himself into the police, and he had gone through a rehabilitation program, and he now wanted to see him. His child was also nonverbal and had some physical limitations. And whenever his father would come to see him, he had a trauma response. And part of that trauma response was he would soil himself, he would hide under the table. And over time, he got really attached to me. And when his father would come, his reactions just told me that this is a kid that's never going to be okay. And that, everybody's got a story, right? And so in that, I was so attached to him and I was so afraid for him for his future, that it made me really think about, you know, as my husband would say, assholes are made, not born. You know, we all have a story and we all have a pathway. There was another child who refused to see their parent. I wouldn't facilitate the visit. And a lawyer called me and said, we just went before the judge and you have to come to court tomorrow because it's this particular judge. And he says, you're going to jail because you've defied his court order and you're going to jail. So I was 22. I called up the lawyer on an advisory committee and he said, pack your toothbrush, you're going to jail. And so I went to court. I was terrified. I was terrified. It was my first experience in court, and I had many after that testifying. But the judge kept me on the stand and played with me. He asked me 1,000 questions, a lot about me understanding the policies, a lot about me understanding my obligations to facilitate his court orders, even though the child was refusing to attend the visits because of their trauma history. And then after about 30 minutes, he said to me, I have one last question for you. Do you choose to wear your hair like that? It was the most overt power move that I said, no, I just look like this today because I'm really nervous.
I just like to say that I would love to see the Dawn of now respond then versus the Dawn of 22, you know?
True. It was one of those moments where I learned that most things look harder than they actually are, right? So, and then I moved on to work with the police and I moved to victim services for about 10 years, which was an incredible experience. And when I was with victim services, I was always really keen on, dedicated, really about being responsive to community needs. And we had started a program recognizing that Canadian newcomers or marginalized, racialized people didn't want anything to do with us because they thought we were police, which we weren't. We were civilian employees. But we hired people to go into informal gathering places in communities to make connections, people who could identify with the groups in which they were trying to provide support. And then there was a particularly impactful situation when a number of Lebanese folks, Canadian-born individuals living in Lebanon were evacuated because of war and brought back to Canada. And one of the things that we were that we did do was we greeted them as victim services and we got them housing and we brought them to these hotels and we facilitated debriefing sessions for them. And they didn't understand the area. Many of them hadn't been to Canada since they were very, very young. And so we would have debriefing sessions, but we would meet them at their hotels and we would walk them to where they would have these psychological debriefs. And I would watch their children so they would get a break. And their stories of profound resilience and of trauma were heartbreaking. And then when they came back to Canada as Canadian citizens, people said things like, why do they want bottled water? They're so privileged. They want so many things that are unreasonable. And I thought, well, if you lived in a community where drinking water might kill you or your children, you'd want some bottled water too. And when I would attend the hotel with my kids, I would have been separated at that time. So it had like, no, I was still probably married to my first husband. I had like a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. We'd come there every weekend and we would hang out with them. And my kids got together, my 5-year-old Mara, got together all her toys to give to the children who were trapped in these tiny rooms. And the city of Windsor swooped in and said, we're going to help you out. We're going to give you all passes to the aquatic parks in Windsor because we know you're going crazy and you are stuck in hotel rooms. And because I was there with them all the time, we realized people didn't have bathing suits. They didn't bring bathing suits. How are they going to go to these aquatic parks? So we went all out to the Value Village. I went on their behalf and bought bathing suits. Well, many of these people were Muslim and they weren't going to wear bathing suits to go to these aquatic parks. So then we went back to the Value Village and bought appropriate bathing outfits. But really, it was a lesson in you just got to stop, learn, and listen and learn from people and make sure that you're serving their needs and you're not really prioritizing your own needs or guessing what they need. Stop, listen. That led, to me doing us facilitating at Victim Services treatment groups. Us doing treatment groups with female survivors of political torture, which was probably one of the most impactful and meaningful things that we did at Victim Services. And then the last story, and I'll make it brief because now I know I'm rambling, was when I was hired at the hospital. I was hired at Hotel Dieu Grace after a physician murdered a nurse. And it was the impetus, or one of the impetuses for Bill 168, the workplace violence legislation. And when I was hired, the doctors were really, really angry that the hospital had settled a lawsuit and had created this position. And I was chosen for that position to go in and to mediate disputes or to, make sure that there was no more violence in the hospital. And I remember that pivotal moment when it was 7:30 in the morning and I stood up to give my speech to the doctors about how excited I was about this new role and it's going to be great. And we're going to all get along so much better than we did before. And I'm here to help you. And there were 75 docs in the room and 69 of them collectively got up and walked out of the room as a sign of protest. And I think perhaps, Sarah, that's when the shift in me happened, when I started thinking, you got to kind of go at conflict head on. And so that was a moment where I paused and I said to myself, what's underneath this and how can I understand better so that I can suit my purpose and my goal, which is to make sure people feel safer at work. So those are the pivotal moments that have led me to the glorious place that I share with you at Laurier.
Awesome, thank you. I also just want to say sorry, folks, that somehow I copy and pasted some of the land acknowledgement versus the access to resources. You're all just lucky it wasn't the argument I was having with my partner earlier today. I'm just joking, we're not fighting, but it could have been awkward. It could have been so much awkward than a land acknowledgement.
I saw your face and I thought, oh no. Oh
yeah,
no,
I know. I had a reaction just because I didn't know what I copied and pasted. Yeah. And, you do not hire me for tech support. That is for sure. That is not what Laurier's dollars are for. I also just want to go back really quickly to what Dawn was speaking to. And some folks might not know what she's referring to with the Hotel de Grace and Bill 168. And I just want to say, as someone who's been doing gendered and sexual violence work for 15 to 17 years, that when I first got to Laurier and I was first doing the work here, it felt very challenging in lots of ways. Not having someone who supervised me who had a particular analysis in the work, and being able to work under Dawn is extraordinary around her risk analysis. And so what people might not know about the Hotel de Grace is a really awful moment in Canadian and Ontario history that changed the course of how we respond to intimate partner violence within the workplace, in which a doctor killed a nurse. And that was not a small moment. It changed the course of gender-based violence work in our province. And it is something that every GBV worker knows about. And Dawn was brought in as the expert to that hospital to change the course for that hospital and to help advise on policy in a really massive level. And so it's like a pretty big honor to be able to work underneath her, because that's she was seen as the person that was going to try and help them heal those massive wounds that were created through that violence. So, yeah.
Really sweet.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. The phrase EDI has become a bit of a buzz phrase across institutions and organizations. It's just like if you just slap EDI on it, then it's almost like you're making meaningful change. You just put that at the beginning of a sentence. Yeah. And I feel like there's lots of people really criticizing that and pushing back, and we're trying to shift how we talk about the work. And I think that the phrase, putting the language of EDI into policies and into trainings and presentations has the potential to tell us a lot, and also nothing about the framework that folks are using to approach their work. And so I'm wondering what the phrase EDI means to you for your work.
So when, I was approached about this talk and the title was like EDI Champions, I thought in a million years, I wouldn't have identified myself as an EDI champion in any way, shape or form. So again, it's humbling and it's beautiful. And yeah, what does it mean? We work in a really hierarchical hierarchical organization where sometimes it doesn't feel like there's equity, right? Amongst even the designations of people across the institution. Do tenured faculty members enjoy more privilege than administrators? Yeah, or staff? You could hear that argument. But then again, do contract faculty members have a more vulnerable and precarious employment relationship than full-time staff? Yeah. You know, I remember a staff development day and talking to some of the folks that work night shift at Laurier and some of the folks that do, you know, the work that doesn't involve having an office. And when we started out this staff development day, the speaker who was speaking to everybody in the audience was like, isn't it great that we could just all get out of our offices and we could come together and have a time to collectively learn? And how that statement really resonated and highlighted the inequalities across our institution for people who are required to do shift work and people who don't have offices and people who do have precarious employment. But I do think when I think about EDI, what it means, what it most resonates with me is the notion of inclusion. And I'm all about community, right? I'm all about how can we create a community? How can we support each other? How can we understand, you know, we don't have to share the same perspectives, but why can't we take time out to understand what each other is feeling and our perspectives on really important issues? And if we're going to focus on understanding and gaining empathy with each other and pausing to prioritize relationships, that feels like true inclusion to me. And that's really what I think. And in all honesty, you brought a lot of this to my knowledge and my learning when you came to our office and said, you know what? Every time we meet, we're going to meet in circle and let's ask each other a getting to know each other question. And sometimes those circles go on for a very long time. And it really creates the foundation of perspective sharing and empathy building and trust building. And that's what EDI, with a focus on inclusion, kind of says and means for me.
Thanks, Dawn. Just keep an eye on time. As someone who holds a lot of privilege in this field, in particular as a straight white cis woman, obviously there's other intersections in your identity, but where do you see your responsibilities and your boundaries lying in this work? And where do you look to for guidance, mentorship, accountability, and solidarity in deepening how you show up?
Yeah, that's a really good question and a really important question for me to reflect on every single day, right? I know that my positionality, I know that my privilege is an extreme privilege, in particular to work in this field, right? In particular to be a person who holds a position of leadership and who has the honor of working amongst people who don't have the same kind of access to resources or opportunities that I do. I think what I spoke about earlier is that sense of humility. And I think I know what I don't know. And I think I have no problem asking for help. And so I'm really mindful that there are many, many things that I just don't have a lived experience or I can't read about to feel it and really know it. And so I do have incredible relationships across the university. And when it comes to accountability and solidarity and you know, putting me in check, I rely on all the folks in my office to do that. I rely heavily on Shireen. I rely on the people that I meet with on a regular basis to do case reviews. And I know I can pick up the phone and I can call, you know, Lauren Burrows or Humera if I want some consult on a case. And now we've got, you know, Hina and Terry and Barrington's folks and Eden as well. You know, I know what I don't know, and I'm never afraid to ask for help. And people who are really expert in the field are really generous with their time and their information, really generous. I'm surrounded by way more brilliant people than I am, including you, Sarah Scanlon. And so I rely on you and Kira and Dana and Rebecca in our office to call me in order. I know the value of the word sure. if you know me, you know, there's probably nothing you can ask me where I won't say sure if I can do it. Because if you're asking me to do something for you, you're telling me you need something, then you need it, and I'm going to help you do it. And also, there are times when my identity helps us, and we have these conversations. There are times, Sarah, when people are going to be far more open to hearing from me than they are in hearing from you. And that may have to do with the fact that I'm pretty vanilla, and people can relate to my aesthetic, and you know, and people can be homophobes as well. So I know that there are times when my privilege needs to be leveraged to get a larger institutional message across, or external message across. But I do spend lots of time reflecting on how I show up in spaces. Am I taking up too much space? How am I affecting people around me? You know, and the older I get, although this would not demonstrate this reality, the older I get, the less I want to talk. So those are the kinds of things that I think about when I think about my privilege and my cis identity.
Thanks, Don. Yeah, we have a lot of amazing colleagues at Laurier, and in the community as well. Obviously, there's folks that we can call on for mentorship and support. And
For sure.
yeah, I feel like we're very privileged in our office that we get to like collaborate and get supported by and get feedback from some pretty amazing humans in offices. It's, yeah, the relationship building piece is pretty special. So thinking about, you know, I've been in my role for about 6 years. I think you've been here for 11, 10 slash 500. It's like hard to remember as our souls are slowly shriveling up on this late January of,
Serene reminded us earlier. Yeah.
2 years into the pandemic, and late into January, our jobs feel a little bit tiresome, but just joking. But I always like to remind myself, as a check to my ego, that there have been many, many people in a long line of activists and advocates and workers before me in this work. And there is a long line of those yet still to come. I think sometimes we are in this reactive, I am important, they need me, I have to respond all the time mentality, and remembering that there has been people everywhere, but specifically at Laurier, who've been fighting for these people for different issues and things connected to our work for a very, very long time. And there's been many countless students in particular, but also staff, researchers, faculty, and activists pushing for change on so many different levels, on so many different issues at Laurier. And so I'm wondering, in your past 10 years here, where have you seen progress within WLU's approach to EDI work that you could have been a part of, or that you just like witnessed other people's push for change that you got to witness and maybe support? Or where do you think we still, where do you think we still have a lot of work to do? And not that those folks haven't pushed for change, but we just haven't met the mark yet.
I think when I first started, there was a lot of discussion and conversation and concerns related to bullying and what was referred to as incivility. And so that was really what was talked about a lot. And how can we address these individual incidents, or how can we repair or restore relationships on an individual basis? There wasn't a lot of talk at that time, not a lot of talk about, microaggressions, systemic discrimination, bullying as a tool of oppression, those people that are experiencing these kinds of harms more often than not. And so I think that it now feels like a requirement. It feels like a requirement for us to pay attention to, and it is a requirement of the institution, to pay attention to issues related to marginalization and oppression. And the institution is putting resources behind it, right? Like Barrington's office is a great example. Our new hire in our office, that we're going to have somebody that's going to be looking at oppression-based harms, that has a lived experience and some expertise around human rights, feels super excited. We have racialized leaders, right? Like, we actually are starting to walk the talk. We're paying attention to hiring. Right? We're recognizing that we're not doing well in certain areas of hiring and that we need to do better. And that work, and there's collective conversations, right? And this is a great example of it. We are coming together and we're carving out time and we're saying, this is complicated and it's messy and I'm not exactly sure what it means. and I'm not exactly sure if I'm doing it right, but I want to invite you to talk to me about this and for us to engage in more conversations about this and carving out time. Like we actually carve out time to have these conversations. Way more attention being paid to mental health. You know, we have mental health first aid training. We now have more than me as just the mental health first aid trainer in the organization. We're recognizing people, I think, in their, we are attempting to recognize people in their totality. So I can be a senior advisor of the Office of Human Rights. I can also be somebody who struggles with anxiety and is a survivor, you know, and how can we make sure that we're looking at people in their totality? And how can we support our community when we know that people are experiencing domestic violence in their homes? And we know that people are experiencing intimate partner violence in their homes. So I think there's more of a, now we are required and we're doing a better job at looking at people in their totality and their identities, as well as the institutions putting some resources behind us. I mean, I do think that as an academic institution, individual rights are prioritized, very prioritized. Academia is super competitive, right? And so people are competing for research dollars and they're competing for positions. And so I think that is a real obstacle for creating the kind of community that allows reparation and restoration of relationships in a way that is meaningful. But I'm pretty excited about it, right? And I think one of the things that I have been gifted with is a boss, primarily Shireen, who has said, you know, this, you're interested in this, you're curious about this, this is what you're seeing, this is a trend, go at it, Don. What do we need, you know? And supporting us in some of the project work that we've done, you know, and being responsive and listening to the needs of the people in our community feels like something that is really important in our institution and in our office, in the work that you do and everybody else.
I'm wondering if you could speak to the second part, which is where do you think we still have a lot of work to do?
Yeah, I think promoting community, recognizing the siloed and the competitive nature of academia. I think we need to talk about prioritizing the needs of community. I think we need to recognize that there are pockets of people that are super passionate about this work, and how can we carve out time, not just say we're carving out time, but actually carve out time and make this not only a priority that's written in some document or some strat plan, but having dedicated conversation and community to do so. How can our offices of like-minded people come together and collaborate and say, how can we do our work better? And how can we support each other? And where am I not good? What am I not good at? And how can you help me? How can we learn to criticize each other in a way that feels like it's productive? How can we create a community where it's safe enough and we have enough trust where we can say to each other, that's not okay, right? Because that's what we need to do. We need to be able to call each other in and say, all right, let's look at what just happened there. It's, you know, I do think there are so many efforts that may be siloed, that I think that this is a great example of bringing people together that may trigger an appetite for doing more or better understanding. I mean, sometimes we get uber focused on our little worlds and we don't take the time to understand what are people doing in other areas that we may not know of. Until recently, I didn't know about the incredible work that Laurier International is doing until they reached out to me and Phyllis said, hey, let's have a coffee. And do you want to join us in doing some stuff over here? That feels really, you know, that cross-cultural pollination of ideas feels really important to me. And in the past, we haven't done that as well.
Thank you. Just conscious of time. Okay, so what do you see as the critical next step in EDI work within your portfolio and perhaps beyond?
I think the pendulum is always going to swing, right? or the focus of what we do is always going to shift depending on what's going on in the community or what's going on in our institution. So, the Me Too movement saw an incredible increase in attention and concerns raised about sexual harassment and sexual violence. The George Floyd homicide really made us pause and pay attention to what's going on in our allyship and in Black Lives Matter movement, as well as, the genocide in the Indigenous communities that we've witnessed over the years have made us stop and pause and go, we need to do better. But you can't know all things and you can't be good at all things, right? There are, 13, 14, Shireen would know how many protected grounds are there. I should know. And I can't be expert in all of them. But what I can do is make sure that I'm listening to people and that I'm responding to what people are saying they need. And that requires me to take time out and just to sit in community with people. The kinds of things we do projects, right? Like we say, something's going on, we need to do a project. So, this past year and a half, my team, primarily led by Kira Rafalski, was doing work around, how can we make sure the calculation of honor roll is equitable given people's varying capacities to be in school full time, and the financial implications that causes, as well as the family stressors. What can we do to ensure that we have sound religious accommodation policies? Are we looking at online bullying? Because that's what seems to be going on right now. And really looking at what people need and what people are saying is the gaps are, and then centering the voice of those who are most at risk of experiencing the harm. Thinking about how can we support students who are working in remote locations, which has been an ongoing project, graduate students primarily, an ongoing project of our office, and how can we create those resources and co-create those resources with our colleagues over at SHRM, who do a great job of creating resources for graduate students. The whole issue of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, and how can we pay attention to the needs of our staff and our faculty who may be struggling with this at home. I'm really excited, very excited about our restorative justice community practice, of which you are tremendously instrumental in leading that initiative. And how can we shift the way we think about people and people who've caused harm, knowing that we all cause harm very frequently, even though I commit to causing as least amount of harm as possible. I know I cause harm. How can we, move forward that thinking of we are in community, people are not disposable, and we can learn and grow from our mistakes. Creating that paradigm shift feels important to me, and that feels important from an EDI lens. How can we take time to value each other's humanity is critical. There's 1,000 initiatives that I get excited about and dive into that get really facilitated and realized by the hard work of the people in our office. But moving forward, the RJ stuff, super stoked about that. Really interested in making sure that we're paying attention to the challenges that the pandemic has created for our staff and faculty, and really looking at instilling fair workplace practices or practices, having groups and departments focus on how they can collectively build community from the moment they come together. Yesterday Kira had like this grand idea of a new project that she wants to do based on just a little bit, like something that came into her brain. And so we'll collectively hash that out. Who should do it? How should we explore it? So I don't know that there's one set answer about what the priorities are. I guess the priorities are what we hear from the people that we're here to serve, what they tell us they need, and what they tell us, how they tell us that we can help them.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people maybe wouldn't know about our office, is because our office is so casework driven and we are doing so much individual support, advocacy, and understanding of impact, that we're able to notice themes and patterns that are coming out of so many different cases and concerns. And we're like, wow, there's a real gap in policy, there's a real gap in process. We keep hitting up against this. What are we going to do to shift that? And I think that's something really wonderful that comes out of our office, is that we notice themes and we get to come together and collaborate on how are we going to respond to this so less harm happens. And thanks for being a leader that supports those kind of open and creative spaces for us. I also just want to give kudos to one thing. You spoke to the restorative justice community practice. Lots of people on this call might not even know what it is. And I just want to give one call out appreciation that the senior leaders at the university have been really supportive of us creating a pretty massive restorative justice process and program and community of practice, and they've funded it. They've been giving us funds to try and actually find a way to explore this in a more meaningful way to embed it across the institution. So just giving some kudos for folks who are helping us do work that feels on the edge for a lot of institutions, and supporting that work.
Yeah, certainly we are very blessed to be, or privileged or fortunate to have an institution that says, yeah, we need to do things differently and we are going to put our money behind it. And so that's felt very validating. I know it's been very exciting for you and for many offices, the Dean of Students office, many offices, to say, oh, yeah, we can do things differently. We can do things better. Yeah.
So I'm going to end this part of the conversation with one last question, and then we're going to move into the Q&As. And as Hina had asked, people are welcome to send questions into the Q&A of what they'd like to hear from Dawn, and questions about our office's approach to EDI or Dawn's office's approach to EDI. So last question, that's a formal question for our couch conversation. I wish we were like sitting and we had tea or something stronger than tea, you know. Is I always like to hold space for all the brilliant humans that my work and learnings have grown from. And I'm wondering if you have a favorite quote or reflection from an EDI practitioner, activist, academic that you find really useful and helps ground your work.
Yeah, you know what, that kind of, that has shifted, that shifts over time. And so right now, the thing that's staying, there's two things that stay in my brain. For the past 20 years, I have said, everything seems harder than it actually is. And that's a little bit of me stealing, even though I didn't know until about 5 years ago, I was stealing the kind of quote of Nelson Mandela's, which is, it seems impossible until it's done. I just believe that everything seems so much harder than it actually is. But lately, and he certainly isn't an EDI champion, but I've really been struck by the quote of Ernest Hemingway, which is the best way to know that you can trust someone is to trust them, right? And if we really want to be an inclusive environment, and if we really want to value each other, we've got to extend each other trust, sometimes blindly, and just see if it sticks. And so I really pay attention to when I'm violating, to not violating trust, right? Because that feels critically important to me in my work. I can't violate trust, because once you do, it's like impossible to get back, right? So those are the things, in particular, the Ernest Hemingway quote that's resonating with me today,
Yeah,
which is the way my brain works.
Yeah, our whole office. Well, no, it's not true. Poor Kira and Rebecca, they have to deal with Dana, Dawn, and I constantly having new things that we're super excited about that are pulling our passion. And so I just want to remind folks that we're moving into the section of the conversation where folks are welcome to ask questions, put forward ideas or thoughts they'd like to, pull from Dawn. She's a long time brilliant human on a lot of different topics, or you can just hear our two ADHD brains coming up with nonsense, or I can come up with more questions. But the first one might feel a little bit more streamlined and less chaotic. If there's things that you're feeling thoughtful about, or that Dawn already said that is sparking a reflection, we'd love to hear from you. Yeah. I'm wondering, Dawn, just as we're like waiting, because I know people always take a hot minute to think of Q&A questions. If there's something in this conversation, I think this thing happens where I sent Dawn some of the questions last night, being like, these are some of the things I would like to kind of hear from you and that I think would be interesting to talk about. And so I know you did probably a little bit of prep work before, but I'm wondering, as you move through answering these questions and reflecting on it, if there's any other thoughts that came up that you didn't get the chance to speak to, or didn't get much chance to speak to, that's like sparked a thought, or something that you would be interested in sharing.
Well, I feel like I've shared an awful lot in the last, it feels like there's been a lot of sharing going on.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, which I thought, which I actually thought would be more difficult than it actually was. to, in particular, the personal stuff, right? Like, and what is the story that led me to where I am today in my private life, and, the extension of trust and trusting that I could hold that conversation, knowing that it would feel like just having a conversation with you. But there's nothing right now. I might process it and say, okay, Terry, can I have another hour? No, I'm never going to do that. But right now, no, there's nothing that sticks with me.
Okay, so we have a question. It's a really good one. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Can you please share one thing you'd like to see happen in the coming year if you could wave a magic wand and funding wasn't a concern? One piece of work that would excite you to undertake?
Oh boy, only one. I would like only one. Okay. I would like us to pay more attention to the experience of staff and faculty that may be experiencing intimate partner violence and domestic violence in their homes. I would like us to be responsive to what's going on during the pandemic, and to recognize that this is a serious, profoundly critical issue that the university should be looking at, that impacts us not only individually, but as an institution as a whole. Also recognizing the shame and embarrassment that comes with being a professional man or woman who's living in an environment where there is violence. And in fact, I'm writing a proposal that will be done tomorrow that I'm submitting to the federal government for some money for it. But Anne-Marie, if you got some extra money bumping around in Laurier International, I've got some ideas for you.
See, this is the thing about Dawn. She hustles, so she's always looking for money. There's never not a grant being submitted or an idea for one. So if anyone here has extra dollars, I really thought you were going to say the restorative justice hub, but that's maybe just where my brain is obsessed.
Well, it's because that's already underway, right? And I'm thinking about something that's not
Sounds
underway.
like old hat.
Exactly. Old news. Sorry.
So another question that's came in is, where do you see the Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Office in 5 years as far as goals and mission? And how can our community support your work and achieve the goals you've developed? That comes from Tolu, one of our awesome colleagues who absolutely supports our work. You also can read the question in the chat if you want to reread
No,
it.
I don't. It's a beautiful question though, Tolu, and
yeah.
it demonstrates your commitment to community and growing together. 5 years. Well, in 5 years might not be my vision. It might be somebody else's vision in 5 years. Who knows if we'll, be alive in 5 years, but see, exactly. I would really like to see us getting more expertise around, and we are in the process of doing that, around oppression-based harm and racism in particular in our office. I would really like for us to be able to do more dialogue, hold more conversations with each other, from our office having conversations with students to our office holding more conversations with senior leaders. I would like to see, if I had that magic wand that Anne-Marie was talking about, I would like to see there be a centralized hub at the university that is specific to EDI and human rights and restorative justice, and a place that is recognized as a center where people can come that need wraparound support for any issues related to those topics. I would like to see us grow the potential for using clinical students in our graduate programs in the School of Social Work to give them opportunities and to support the SV work and the gender-based violence work in the intimate partner violence work. I would like to see more group work, bringing collectives together, because I think there's tremendous power in bringing survivors together in group to talk about their experiences. There's things that just pop into my brain at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I wake up and I'm like, I like this. I really like the direction. I really like the collaboration between our units that's going on, and the connections between Barrington's brand new, not brand new anymore, but the new people in and the AVP EDI office and our office and CSETI and you and Tolu and Melissa and the Dean of Students office and other partners across. I really am all about thinking how can we collectively leverage our individual skills to create something beautiful and in a hub, in a center.
Thanks, Don. I think a lot of folks are feeling hopeful that more opportunities for collectivity in this work would be, create a lot of meaning. Another question is, if you could give one piece of advice to folks looking to enter your field, what would it be? I think we hear that a lot, eh? A lot of folks come to our office and say, we'd love to be working in your office. We'd love to be doing this type of work. I know they don't know. They don't know the hours and the soul impacts, but
it's beautiful. You know what? It's beautiful work. It is. We get to see, and people ask you this question all the time and ask us this question all the time. How do you do your work day in and day out? You know, I always get like, what do you do for your mental health? You know, or how do you do this work for a long period of time? It's exhilarating. It's the beauty and the rush that you get from seeing people at their very best, even when they've had the biggest challenges. I have seen people rise to so many occasions and just go through it. You just got to go through it. And sometimes that can feel almost impossible. And sometimes you can't do that unless you have a community of support. For people that want to get into this work, I think you have to do a lot of self-work, a lot of reflection, because this work is not about me. It's not about Sarah Scanlon. This work is about something bigger and more important. I know it's, you know, this work is something bigger and more important. And if you make it about your ego, and if you aren't really about doing the work to think of how you're showing up or maybe causing harm, then it's not the work for you. And be prepared to be terrified and be okay with being afraid. Yeah, it's okay to be afraid. In fact, it's required. And if you're not doing the job right.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So another question is, in this work, we mess up a lot. And for folks who are newer to this work, that can feel really scary. Or maybe for all of us, that can feel really scary and really challenging to know that it's like impossible not to cause harm and it's impossible not to mess up. And particularly when you hold a lot of privilege, you are going to cause a negative impact on the people you're supporting and your colleagues who you really care about. And sometimes care isn't enough. And so I guess my question, or the question is, how do you show up and how do you keep growing around those pieces and recognizing that you have and will cause harm as someone who's been in the field for a long time?
I mean, the first thing is recognizing it and inviting or imploring people to tell you when you've done it, right? There are multiple moments, and I know this to be true, and it's been a learning adventure working with you, who we're both pretty strong, passionate human beings. We take up some space, the two of us. And when you come to me and say, and in a moment when you said to me one time, and I've told this story to many people, I don't even know if I've probably told you the story. We're in a meeting. You're telling me you're drowning. I say, Sarah, what can I do to help you? And you said to me, I sent you an email 2 weeks ago telling you I was drowning, and there was radio silence. You didn't respond. And you said that in front of everybody in our group. And I felt crushed. And I felt so fortunate that you felt like you could do that. And, you know, I cause harm in ways that I can't even begin to imagine. And I pray that the people that I trust and respect will call me out on that. And I'm gonna mess up. And I got, this people might not know this about Shireen, but she is an incredible supervisor to work for. I have and the message was from the moment I started, you're going to make mistakes. I expect you to make mistakes. And this is mistakes, which is a little bit different from what you're asking, Sarah, but it speaks to the kind of community environment that we're hoping to create. And from the moment I started, you're going to make mistakes and we're going to work through them. just be prepared to own them and be accountable. And I think that's what we're asking for our community, our students and our colleagues, right? We're going to screw up. Let's hold each other accountable, and let's do that with care and humanity. Yeah, and I know I cause harm in some ways that I'm not even aware of. So I do a lot of work. Believe it or not, I do a lot of self-reflecting on the things that I say, and yeah, ponder that and do work on it.
And I'm just gonna end with one last question, probably, is that what do you identify as 3 of the most critical skills to do like the particular channel of EDI advocacy support work that you are a part of?
You can't be afraid to feel afraid. Prioritizing community above your individual needs. I would have said before, really try to understand other people's interests, which is a critical part of the role, but a basic skill of many mediators now, I would say, do the work to understand yourself and what you're bringing to these cases and what you're not bringing to these cases, and know what you don't know and be okay to say it. Is that 3? Did I go over?
Probably.
Probably.
I support that for you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Also, the man of the hour sent a message into the Q&A that I'm just going to read out saying, being Lamine, sorry. Thank you, Dawn, for sharing your experience and your story about EDI work. It is not always easy to put ourselves in such a vulnerable position.
Oh, thank you, Lamine. Thank you. It's a real honor to be able to even be considered for the same space. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being so, Lamine, thanks for being so good at shaking Laurier up that they created a whole series that we get to talk about how to keep shaking Laurier up. So yeah, your badassery has created waves that we can all
Important word.
surf on.
Important
Sometimes
word.
drown in, sometimes surf on. It's a healthy combination of the 2
For sure.
on our good days,
Yeah.
you know? So if you're cool with it, Dawn, I think I'm gonna wrap us up. And yeah, just give so much thanks. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be able to chat with you today. And obviously you are my boss, and so we get to have lots of great conversations about this, or you try to be my boss. I don't know, it's complicated.
True.
I'm
Yeah.
not easy to supervise. But this was really awesome. And I have so much appreciation for the space coming together and for the opportunity to have both like reflective and thoughtful and vulnerable and, you know, challenging conversations. Yeah, I think what feels really important to remember is that, you know, attending a training is not the same thing as like reflecting and sitting in and trying to push ourselves. And so these types of spaces are really brilliant because they ask us to try and integrate the things other people are saying into our own bodies and our own lived experiences. So yeah, so first I want to thank again to Shreen Rowe, our humble but tough
Fearless
AF leader. Yeah, she is a combination of all things awesome and terrifying at once. So thank you to Shreen for helping to kick off today's event, and a massive special thank you to the invited speaker, the fabulous Dawn McDermott. Our office is Fearless Leader, and also, yeah, someone who at this institution doesn't take no easily, but does that with a lot of like care and prioritization of relationships. So thanks for fostering that and for constantly challenging us in the institution to do better. I'd also like to thank Diane for providing the live captions, and to everyone for attending today's events. Thanks for showing up. It sounds a little bit like woo-woo, but like showing up matters. Taking the time to decide that these are important conversations in the middle of your workday. I know you folks are all very busy. We all are. There's a lot on our plates. It's a really challenging time. And the fact that you thought that this was a priority conversation to be a part of, that means something, and that gestures at those of us with marginalized identities, that this is something that you want to keep deepening in relationship to this community, our collective capacity to do this work better. So thank you. And finally, I'd like to thank our event sponsors, including the Office of the Associate Vice President, Equity diversity, inclusion. And I want to pause there for a second because they reached out to us. They asked Dawn to do this, asked me to do this, and were beautifully generous with their time in supporting us in doing this, and just have always been such fantastic colleagues in this work. And we're so grateful for all the amazing work that they're doing that we get to collaborate with them on, or even just witness and be impacted by. Also, much thanks for the brilliant Tshepo Institute for the study of contemporary Africa, as well as Laurier's Black Faculty and Staff Caucus. And we continue to be so excited to see all the amazing work that those folks do, and the ways that they're changing Laurier. As a reminder, the next event is in the Lamine Diallo EDI speaker series, will take place on Wednesday, February 9th, 2022 at 2 p.m. with the invited guest, Dr. Clinton Beckford from AVP EDI University of Windsor. So please tune in for that. I'm looking forward to it. And once again, thank you so much for our sponsors for having us, and all of you for committing to make real change. Thanks,
Thank
folks.
you so much. Thank you. Goodbye, folks.
Thanks everyone for joining today's session. I really appreciate you taking the time to join. And I guess have a great day. Thanks again, Diane. Diane's gone.
That was great. Thank you.
I'm going to end the session now.
Thanks, Ina.